Welcome to this presentation on the history of Bexley, in which I'll be focusing on how Bexley became an exclusive suburb of Columbus, Ohio. I am Dr. Scott King-Owen. I teach at Bexley High School, and I'm a trustee of the Bexley Historical Society, and have been working on this research for the past 4 years in an attempt to understand the origins of Bexley and specifically how Bexley's past intersects with minorities in Columbus. The story of Bexley really starts with the Broad Street corridor, because in the post-Civil War era, this was the most fashionable part of Columbus for Columbus residents to live in. The area we call Old Town East was a silk stocking district of mansions built by residents who had made it rich in various industries and decided to pour their money into grand houses along Brighton and Broad Streets. But Broad Street was also close in proximity to more working class neighborhoods. If you went north along Fifth Avenue and the railroad, you would have seen working class folks in much less pretentious housing. You would have also encountered the largest amount of Columbus's African American population on the east side, from downtown Columbus on into what we now call the King, Lincoln, and Mount Vernon neighborhoods. So along Broad Street, you had essentially two groups of people: incredibly wealthy folks immediately on the street and the Old Town East neighborhoods, and then to the north, working class families, white and black, but especially Columbus's black population. And this black population provided a lot of the work done in these wealthy homes along Broad Street. Many of the African American women in the King, Lincoln, and Mount Vernon neighborhoods did domestic work for wealthy residents along Broad Street. In fact, the #1 occupation for a black woman in Columbus just after 1900 would have been domestic service. Many African American men would have also found work in the industries in Columbus. They would have found work as janitors and other kinds of laboring positions available to them. It's at this time in the late 19th century, before we get a Bexley, that the norm in Columbus is increasingly focused on racial segregation in all social settings. There's already a physical segregation in terms of where African Americans live, but in sharing social spaces, we find increasingly the belief that, especially after the Civil War, that African Americans and white Columbus residents don't mix, and they don't need to belong in the same space at the same time. Partly, I think this is due to an increase in the black population of Columbus between 1870 and 1910. There's about a 10,000 person increase there. And as more African Americans are in the city, more city residents are responding to this influx by heightening this restrictive environment that had already existed in many ways, just never formally articulated. Examples of this would be, for example, Franklin Park, where the conservatory was built in 1895, the park established in 1886. African Americans were generally allowed on Sundays. The expectation is that that would be the time for them to use the park, unless they reserved the park for a particular Emancipation Day celebration or some other event ahead of time. But there wouldn't be a sharing of the park or social space with other folks, white folks at that time. Broad Street Presbyterian, for example, built in 1887, had a separate balcony for black worshipers. And you will read more and more, especially after 1900, that these racial lines will become much more overt, much more discussed, particularly when African Americans challenge them and say, "Why are you doing this to us?" Broad Street in the 19th century was a tree-shaded lane. The closer you got to downtown Columbus, um, it was a beautiful thoroughfare for these mansions along Broad Street. It was eventually paved and it became a favorite of bicycle riders. Notice in the middle, you've got the traveling horse and cart folks here. You've also got a side area for travel as well. So it's a divided street with this beautiful row of trees all along it. And that divided street leads to Bexley. Before the Civil War, Bexley was largely an agricultural community. There was a small settlement located around Pleasant Ridge. It was named Pleasant Ridge. We see that name on maps from the time period. Most people in the area farmed, and there was a little tiny settlement of European German Catholics north of Broad Street, and a scattering of large landowners, perhaps the largest of which were the Barr family, who owned quite a bit of Bexley but sold it off in pieces. Today, the reminder of their existence is the octagonal house that you pass on Broad Street, built in 1853. At the time, it would have been one of the few large homes along Broad. A little bit later, between 1873 and 1876, we get Capital University in the Pleasant Ridge area. They buy the property and then develop a school there for training Lutherans. It brings quite a number of German residents into the area. In fact, if you look at the 1910 census, 72% of Bexley residents' fathers came from Germany. You would have heard strains of German being spoken in the 1880s and 1890s alongside of Capital University. Early Bexley, an agricultural world, sparsely settled, also had a black landowner. His name was Thomas Peyton, a Civil War veteran who came to Columbus sometimes after the war ended, managed to save up enough money to pay for 19 acres of land in central Bexley. The deed is October 31st, 1868. The price, $1765 and some change, which is about $30,000 today. Peyton brings his extended family to live on the 19 acres, and he sells bits and pieces of the land to them, Amanda and Gabriel, and a relative that we're not exactly sure how they're related, named Benjamin Fields. And this group of folks made their living in a property that is essentially bounded by Drexel, Broad, Cassidy, and Fair. So if you can imagine a box containing that, their property, their 19 acres, would have sat in that, along with some other farmers that you'll see in a moment on a map. Like the people around them, the Peytons farmed, producing about $150 worth of farm produce a year. Peyton himself drove a wagon and hauled materials for folks. So as a manual laborer, he's accustomed to a life of hard work, but was trying to build a life for himself. With his wife, Annie, he managed to work out a life that was satisfactory to both of them until 1889, when his wife sued him for divorce. In the divorce proceedings established in the court, the original manuscripts Note that Annie accused him of being abusive and being a drunkard and not supporting her and giving her, the money and things that she really deserved. So it was a pretty bitter experience. They were both able to hire pretty good attorneys in Columbus from reputable law firms. But in the end, it looks like that Thomas was able to convince the court that, in fact, Annie was just grubbing for his money. And she seems to have disappeared from the record, leaving him to raise their 3 children. That same year is when he also sells his property. $18,900 is what his and his family's property goes for. It's about $532,000 today. And the Paytons move one by one to South Bexley behind Capital University. So that's Bexley's first black landowner, who's going to stick around for a little bit, and in a few minutes we'll get to what happens to him and his family. We can see here on the map, this is Broad Street. You can see the Barr family. There's Elizabeth Barr. Here's Elizabeth Barr's name again. This map from the 1870s shows the fairgrounds. Today, where it says fair, this is Franklin Park, if that helps you kind of picture where we are. The land owned here is today Wolf Park. John M. Pugh, a judge. George McCalla right here was a farmer who owned the sort of like more northern portion of Wolf Park. And it's where there was an Adena Indian mound that was still existing until the McCallas excavated it in the late 1880s, removed the artifacts, including a human skeleton. The Bexley Historical Society today has those artifacts. The mound, which was about 20 feet high, about 70 feet around, is no longer there. Next is the largest landowner on this little corridor here, D.W.C. Sawyer, who's a merchant who moved to Columbus to sort of establish himself as a gentleman farmer. So he builds a fairly large house, sends his sons off to OSU, and then right next door we see the Paytons, who live next to Ernest Drant, catty corner to William Norwalk, next to Joseph Smith and Susanna Brantz. So this little tiny corner here, we can imagine sort of like Drexel and Fair, and then Cassidy kind of bounding this area here. This 19 acres occupied by Amanda, Charlotte, Gabriel, Benjamin, and Thomas until the late 1880s, when they get an offer that is just too good to refuse. The offer that the Paytons and the other landowners in that corridor get will become what is today Bullitt Park, named for some real estate developers from Philadelphia. They and other real estate developers had had their eyes on the bluffs, as they were called, beyond Alum Creek in the late 1880s. As Broad Street is extending eastward, these real estate folks see that this land, this prime property, this farmland, will soon, at some point, become worthwhile for investment, and it will become residential. So Robert Round and Thomas Nouse established Parkview in 1887. You recognize the name of a prominent street in Bexley. And the other 2 guys, perhaps the most important, are John and Logan Bullitt, a father and son from Philadelphia. They buy 500 acres around what today we call Drexel Circle, then called Columbus Circle, in the 1880s in order to create Bullitt Park. Bullitt Park land sales are about, there are about 19 property owners by 1892. So it's not an instant success, but they certainly are getting people interested in the property. They feel confident enough through their lawyer to ask to be incorporated as a separate village, in fact, in that same year, because they want to avoid paying Columbus property taxes. They believe that Columbus we'll never do anything for them, and they'll just continue to pay taxes that will go to other people's benefit. Editorials in the Columbus Dispatch really took exception to these Bullitt Parkers, accused them of being an aristocratic suburb, and the maneuver was shut down. The next year, the economy crashed, and that's one of the key reasons that the Bullitt Park development stalled temporarily. This Panic of 1893 is America's most intense depression until the Great Depression. It will last until about 1898, when the United States will declare war on Spain. And that war will give John and Logan Bullitt, well, Logan Bullitt by this point, the opportunity to rescue their investment a little bit. The Bullitt family offers to the state of Ohio the use of this undeveloped Bullitt Park land for a war camp, Camp Bushnell, which will help stage soldiers on their way to the war effort against Spain. So they'll get them organized, train them, see who's going to get accepted into the U.S. service, and then have them march off and give their lives for Uncle Sam. This camp operated roughly between April of 1898 to about October of 1898, but really May, June are its peak months. It brought 15,000 men into the camp and about 100,000 visitors, including one day when there's something like 75,000 people who show up to wish the boys off to war. Not only does the camp help establish Bullitt Park with some positive associations, patriotism, yes, we love America, go United States, those good Bullitt people doing their bit for the country. But it also leads to the city of Columbus extending water and electric lines. There's even a telegraph line extended to Camp Bushnell. So the bringing together of lots of people to see this property, the positive associations with the war, help rehabilitate Bullitt Park's reputation slightly, to some degree. And the Bullitt, folks, make some money out of it as well. The city of Columbus pays them $10,000 for the damage that's done to Bullitt Park by the soldiers while they're there. Here is the plat map for Bullitt Park, one of the plat maps, because it gets amended several times. You can see Parkview Avenue, and the lots are laid out, Broad Street. Josiah Lunn here, one of the last large landowners holding out. This would, of course, be today the Columbus School for Girls, CSG. Columbus Circle at the time, not Drexel Circle. And a plan for the Columbus Common, a little park in the north. So this is going to be a residential area with large lots. These are very large lots, designed to appeal to people who've got the money and the ability to move beyond Columbus, move beyond the city limits for perhaps a country show house maybe, or a small, little getaway from the cares of city life. Bullitt does have restrictions in the deeds for his properties, and the main restriction you see is a required setback. The house that you build has to be so many feet from the road. Other than that, it's the cost of living in Bullitt Park and the cost of commuting to Bullitt Park that makes sure that this area is going to be reserved for the elites. At the time, it was a very, very undeveloped property. You can see tiny trees here having just been planted here. It's very open because it was formerly agricultural land. You can see the guys who owned Bullitt Park have put in some improvements. This is Broad Street into Drexel Circle. And they've continued the practice of dividing Broad Street to a main and then a and two sides. Presumably one day, the trees would be big and tall, just like they were closer to downtown. You can see the soldiers' tents along the top here. So this is quite a different view from what people expect from Bexley today, which is so covered in trees that it has been designated an arboretum. And so, of course, developed with homes. With the revitalization of the economy and the positive associations with Bullitt Park and patriotism, Parkview and Bullitt Park land sales do increase after 1898. And we see the growing nucleus of some very influential and powerful families in the area who are going to lead the creation of Bexley. These are people like Robert Jeffrey and Malcolm Jeffrey, Colonel Lincoln Kilbourne, Frank P. Holtzman, Joseph Ralston, Ian Huggins, General Eugene Powell, who had already been involved in the Parkview development. These are nouveau riche people. They don't come from aristocratic pedigreed families, with the exception of Colonel Kilbourne, whose ancestor founded Worthington. They have factories in their families, such as the Jeffrey Manufacturing Company. Kilbourne's family has Kilbourne Jacobs. Holtzman is lured to Columbus to build his piano stool factory. And today, it no longer stands, but if you go to the Kroger on Main Street next to Alum Creek, that's where Holtzman's piano stool factory used to be. Joseph S. Ralston, who was a railroad car builder. Ian Huggins, a noted corporate attorney who corresponded frequently with President Taft. Powell, a real estate developer. All of these guys are well-educated, well-connected, wealthy men. And they bring the people of Pleasant Ridge to a meeting on the Jeffrey Terrace in 1908 to push for the incorporation of this new village that they're proposing. Because there are not enough people in Pleasant Ridge to incorporate. There are not enough people in Bullitt Park to incorporate. And the people of Pleasant Ridge had already been meeting and talking about how they could improve their neighborhood with lighting and sidewalks. So it seemed like a natural fit to bring the two groups together and make a new suburb. But it definitely was two different social and economic groups. The Columbus Dispatch at the time noted that the Bullitt Parkers, as they often called them, owned automobiles, saddle horses. They played golf and tennis. While the people of Pleasant Ridge, well, they're farmers. Many of them chase the unwilling pig, tether the calf, and coax the Plymouth Rock into an abundant field of eggs. So you're getting this marriage of two different worlds as it's portrayed in the Columbus Dispatch. But beneath that reality, there is a little bit more complicated story. When you look at the 39 landowners who petitioned for the creation of Bexley in 1908, you find that the majority of them are involved in either contracting, real estate, housing, or some kind of business that would benefit from having an incorporated village. In fact, the 39 landowners who signed the petition, only about 19% of them are farmers. So the two halves of Bexley might be socioeconomically different, but the driving force for the creation of Bexley is business people. It's really capitalists and these people in South Bexley living on Main Street, what we call Main Street today, who are wanting this new village to be created for them. So they can avoid paying taxes, as the newspaper persistently reports. Here's some pictures of some of these leading founders. You can see Joseph Ralston on the left. In the middle is Frank Holtzman, who would go on to be Bexley's first mayor, and his family had a mansion on Parkview, which was demolished in the late 20th century. Then on the very end is Robert Jeffrey, whose family owned the Jeffrey Manufacturing Company, which today, North 4th Street in Columbus, you can see there is a very, very nice modern housing development going in there that used to sit on, or sits on, what used to be the Jeffrey Manufacturing Company property. Robert himself is actually mayor of Columbus at one point before he decides that Bexley will be his domain. With the incorporation of Bexley, it sets the stage for an incredible increase in the Bexley real estate market. Between 1910 and 1920, Bexley grew pretty steadily. There's only 615 people in 1910. It's a very small place. There's only 1,300 in 1920, which I know doesn't seem like a lot to us today, but that's a 118% increase in that decade. And it's due to real estate developers. There are 7 companies who were incredibly active between 1910 and 1915 in North and Central Bexley, and they lay out a stunning 14 subdivisions. So little tiny streets or a couple of streets with 20 lots for houses. Places like Ardmore, for example, and Bexley Park. These are names that are familiar to modern day Bexley residents, but at one point was just a name on a plat map, a vision in someone's eye on a landscape that had nothing else on it. These developers had a code word that they used consistently in their planning, in their work, and that word was restricted. You see it in almost all of their ads. I tried to count the number of times the word restricted appeared in Bexley ads, and I eventually gave up because it is so ubiquitous. And you might think, oh gosh, what kind of restrictions are we talking here? Are we mentioning like race restrictions? And really at the beginning, race restrictions were not as common as one might think. They were things like a required setback from the street, your house must be 50 yards from the street, whatever number they picked. Single family home was probably the most common one that's going to shape Bexley's future, because it meant that Bexley would become exclusively residential for families with enough money to build a home. And sometimes these restrictions set the amount that you had to spend. This house had to be of a certain value. To even afford a lot in Bexley in 1912, you needed to have at least $450 and upwards of $850, which is between $12,000 and $22,000 today. That requires quite a bit of money. And some of these developers did let people put money down and pay over time, pay on an installment. But consider that the average worker in 1910 made roughly $500 a year. And by the 1920s, that's only going to increase to about $700 a year. So these lots are really out of the range of ordinary working class people. These lots are for middle and upper middle class folks who've got enough disposable income to move outside of Columbus and build a $7,000, $8,000, $15,000 house in this new suburb. You might think that the real estate developers just sort of came up with all of this on their own independently, but no. They all belong to the Columbus Real Estate Board, which was organized in 1908, and which in turn connected them to an Ohio Real Estate Board and then a National Real Estate Board. As the profession of being a realtor is becoming much more organized, and in fact, they will even trademark the term realtor and establish a set of standards for what a realtor is and does and should be. This connecting, professionalizing realtor world means that they all share the same expectations, they all share the same language, they share the same designs. They reach out to other suburb developers in Kansas City, in Maryland, in California, and they ask, what are you doing in order to solve this problem? And it creates a set of common expectations that dominate the design of Bexley. So that Bexley is going to be very similar, at least in layout, in terms of lot size, in terms of what the houses are going to look like. The other factor that we cannot ignore here is that Bexley is a landlocked small village, 2 by 2.5 miles, and that's going to heighten its exclusivity. And that really is a product of Bexley's troubled relationship with the city of Columbus. When Bexley incorporated in 1908, it got sued by the city of Columbus for a faulty incorporation, and then Bexley later won the case. But that set up a 20-year antagonism between Bexley and Columbus over access to water, access to sewer. Columbus repeatedly said, when do you want to be annexed? You should be annexed. Columbus Dispatch editorials frequently called Bexley residents selfish and said you should join the greater move to a bigger Columbus. And Bexley consistently said no and resisted that process. So one of the things that Columbus did is it went ahead and quickly annexed all the land around Bexley, so that Bexley became hemmed in by the city of Columbus and couldn't really expand and go anywhere. But Bexley seemed to be fine with that and fended off every proposed annexation to the city proposal that came about in the teens and 20s. Here's some advertisements promoted by one realty company, the Forest Realty Company in Bexley in the time period. And I like these advertisements because they are image driven. Most realtors at this time in the dispatch are using text and exclusively text. But one, the Forest Realty Company, decided that it would commission a series of beautiful illustrations of their Bexley Park subdivision, which you can see here. It says, in the district of fine homes in the first one. It's a growing suburb, the suburban home place. The language of these ads and the pictures themselves are meant to sell Americans on this beautiful suburban single-family home ideal in a restricted, exclusive neighborhood with sewers and sidewalks and the safety of having a secure investment. And we're going to see that that language, as well as the physical conditions of Bexley's exclusivity, they reinforce each other and create really this aristocratic suburb that Columbus residents had noted as far back as 1892. Two of the most important developers in this process are Alexander Forrest and Demi P. Cook. Bexley's real estate market is hot. The value of property in Bexley is increasing dramatically, from $1.25 million in 1911 to $7 million by 1920. These two developers, perhaps more than any other developers, took the lead in marketing Bexley to people with the money to buy into it. And for good reason for them, because both of them resided in Bexley. So selling their home area, generated, the kind of world they wanted to live in as well as put money in the bank. Typically, Cook and Forrest portrayed Bexley as a garden suburb. It was an ideal place to have a lawn, a garden. The lots were large, which meant poor people can't afford them. You could have fruit trees and chickens. There'd be peace and quiet and beautiful fresh country air. But they almost always said it's still close enough to Columbus that you could quickly commute to your office. So Columbus is not far away, business is not far away. And then in the evening, you can retire to your little country estate and escape the dirt and the cares of the nasty city center. The language of these ads Some of it's quite ridiculous, such as Demi Cook's ad, "Tickle the land with a hoe and watch your produce grow." Oh my. But sometimes the language made it very clear who they expected to reside in Bexley. Think what it means to raise your family in a circle of selected neighbors. How did they get selected? These are people of culture, refinement, individuality, and initiative. These are people with money, and they are going to be exclusively white. To make sure that they are exclusively white, Forrest is going to go beyond all the other land deeds in Bexley and make sure that all of his deeds for his newest development, Stanberry Place, have racially exclusive language in them as a permanently restricted territory. And that came just at the same time as Columbus's African American population had increased 74%. There were wealthy African Americans, middle-class African Americans with money, who may have been able to afford a Bexley lot. And we don't know for sure if Forrest had met with some of them and just turned them down or not. But we know that the inclusion of this language becomes ubiquitous in the 1920s. It's not as prominent before. And it's that same decade, too, that Bexley's market is the hottest it is going to be. The population of Bexley increases 450% in that 10-year period, from a village of 1,000, 1,300 to a village of over 8,000 people. Almost all white, but not quite. Because Bexley retained some space for African Americans. And we're going to talk about the ones who lived in Bexley, but the other group that we're going to encounter in just a few minutes will be domestic servants. Forrest specifically made room for domestic servitude as part of his model of what Bexley would be like. And we're going to see in just a minute how he worked that into his ads for Stanberry Place. So here's Forrest in the middle. He's a Canadian immigrant, comes to Columbus in the 1890s and quickly becomes wealthy as a real estate developer, a subdivider, sometimes you see them called. You see the word restricted in one of his ads on the right for Forrest Realty Company, but it's the ad on the left, the ad on the right that is really crucial to seeing how he thinks of what Bexley will be. He says, the proximity of Stanberry Place to the Bexley car line solves all problems of household help. What does he mean? Well, to live in Bexley meant that you needed to either have a car so that you could drive yourself to downtown Columbus for work, or that you needed to be able to have quick access to the streetcar system. And that streetcar system did run through North Bexley, along Main Street Bexley, behind Capital University. And not only would it allow businessmen to quickly get into downtown and get to work, or maybe shoppers go to do their marketing, but it would allow African American domestic help to be dropped off near Drexel Circle and then walk on to Stanberry Place, where they could do labor for white homeowners. To make it even clearer, here's a deed from Stanberry Place, 1938. That neither the whole of said premises nor any part thereof shall ever be sold, leased, mortgaged, pledged, given away, or otherwise disposed of in any way, shape, or form to any colored person or any other person in whole or part of the Negro race or blood. Nor shall said premises, nor any part thereof, ever be rented to, or used by, or occupied by any colored person, or any person in whole or in part of the Negro race or blood, except such person be a servant, working for the white family or white persons occupying said premises. I've even seen a Stanberry deed that specifically forbids you from leasing or renting the property to organizations that would help African Americans, like the Columbus Urban League or the NAACP. So the language, the message is clear. Bexley is for white folks. African Americans can be there, but only as laborers. So let's talk about domestic servitude in Bexley. Black and white domestics were employed in the village, and at the beginning they were all white. So in 1900 there were only 9 domestics, all located in the Parkview area, all white. But by 1920 there are 50 domestics, and 22% of them are African American. With that decade of huge growth in the Bexley population, we will get 372 domestics by 1930, 44% of them African American. And it will only go down a little bit by 1940 to like 280 something domestics, still a large number of them African American. We don't know very much how they're treated. We do know there's an editorial in the Columbus Dispatch that complains about the housing conditions of Black domestics and domestics in general in Bexley and in Upper Arlington, but don't have really corroborating evidence, don't have any first-person accounts from domestics. So it's very hard to get a sense of what this world is like for them. We do know that there are men, Black men, working for Bexley families as well. Typically, you'll see them as chauffeurs or gardeners. We know that Alexander Forrest built homes in Stanbury Park with domestic quarters included. So the idea was your domestic servant could live with you. We will build space for that to be a reality as part of this house. Bexley had so many domestics, and they were so visible in the community. 6.8% of all Bexley households had a Black domestic in 1930. That the Bexley High School torch included racist jokes about domestic servants in the torch in its student annual. There were 3 Black Bexley High School students in the 1920s in a school that did blackface minstrel shows in 1926, 1929, 1931, and 1932. And one wonders how those 3 Black students thought about that, what that experience was like for them, as these images of African Americans are part of a culture, a racist culture that is developing in the community. So what that leads us to conclude for Bexley and for lots of other places is that lots of children grow up in an atmosphere where they see Black women occupying a very distinct social and economic role. And that role is contrasted with the roles of their mothers. Mom is a committee woman in the public library. She has tea socials. She goes out and solves social problems. And that's because the person doing housework and the onerous task of maintaining the home is Black. It creates this association of being Black with the drudgery of housework. So I have 2 illustrations from the time period. The first is a cartoon from 1911. This cartoon is mocking Bexley in many ways. It says, Bexley is a attractive land entirely surrounded by real estate signs. They weren't wrong in 1911. But the key figure I want to point to you is in the middle, where someone has been hauled in front of the mayor's court, Mayor Frank Chamberlain. It turns out to be an African American, a stereotypically drawn African American from the time period. What's his offense? Stealing turnips, Your Honor. And even then, you note the Bexley police officer there on the side with his club enforcing order. And that is not something that's just recent in American history. Bexley police have a long-standing reputation going back to 1909 for policing the borders and arresting people, especially speeders who come in to the village. On the right, you can see an image, a blackface minstrelsy image in the torch as part of the Boys Glee Club giving a minstrel show. These images testify to a pervasive set of racist assumptions and expectations about African Americans in the Bexley community. And these are assumptions and expectations that we don't normally associate with northern communities as much, though we really should. I told you we would return to the story of the Paytons, and they disappear from Bexley by 1926. Thomas dies in 1915. His daughters start parceling off and selling bits of their property to make ends meet, and eventually they lose everything in 1926 because they're too far in debt to a local mortgage company. Most of the African Americans remaining in Bexley will be in northern part of Bexley along the railroad tracks. And that's because there were two companies or three companies at one point, but really one main one, that offered jobs to Black residents. The Ralston Steel Car Company is the most important because it employed hundreds of workers. There was for a while a sanitary earthenware company. There was a Bell Pottery that never really got off the ground. But it's really Ralston that's most successful. And so Ralston takes over a company town that was laid out for the area in the late 19th century. And those homes are on smaller lots. They're more modest houses. And he's able to sell those or rent them to his workers. And so there's much more diversity in this far northern edge of Bexley. But Bexley is also working towards codifying what it means to be Bexley in the same time period, establishing the expectations of where certain people can live and what businesses can go on there. And that is set by 1923 when a zoning code is established by a working group of Bexley citizens. There is a building inspector, a zoning inspector appointed, and with this code, he is able to enforce the exclusivity of Bexley and the way in which Bexley will develop from then on out. One of the interesting things to note about this code is that South Bexley, along like Livingston, for example, far North Bexley does have in the zoning code the potential for multifamily dwellings, but not the middle. The middle was supposed to be designed for single family homes, people with enough money to afford the lot and the house. And in fact, when a developer wanted to try to create a multifamily English garden city in 1928 in central Bexley, 100 residents petitioned the city council against it, or the village council against it, because they said the Bexley would be flooded with a roving class of renters, and Bexley would become a tenement house district of the worst sort of people. So only along the edges of Bexley, the fringe of Bexley, will we see people in a different racial and socioeconomic situation. This aggressive zoning and Bexley's stable housing market are so successful that Bexley becomes an incredibly safe investment opportunity. And there is a flurry of bonds issued in the 20s for roads and sewers and paving and all kinds of improvements, infrastructure improvements. So many of these bonds are floated because they're stable, the value is stable, and they're a good investment, that Bexley has so much bonded indebtedness that Columbus won't even annex it in 1930 because they can't afford Bexley. That's how rich Bexley has become by that point. And of course, that is the beginning of the time period of the Great Depression, which then further reinforces this exclusivity. A 1936 housing survey, for example, found that Bexley's homes were out of reach for 85% of the residents of Columbus. You just can't get into Bexley. And with the economic downturn, that exclusivity is becoming even stronger. The federal government will get involved in this process as well by surveying all of the areas of the United States in terms of like where you can get money for investing in real estate. And we have these now what we call the redlining maps of the 1930s that result from these efforts. Columbus's redlining map, as we're going to see in a moment, predictably makes Bexley a stable place for investment, whereas its poorer African American neighbors are not so. You can see here, for example, too, the socioeconomic divide between North and Central Bexley. South Bexley is second grade, meaning the blue areas are, well, it's okay for investment, but it's not as good as the green, which is like the A1 premium 100% awesome area for investment. And you can see if you get into North Bexley up here, we get back to second grade and even to third grade in the far north along Rule, for example, where these smaller, very much lower income homes are for workers who will then cross the railroad tracks to the Ralston Steel Car Company. So armed with this federal government-backed redlining system, we go then through decades of housing segregation, socioeconomics reinforcing the separation of different groups of people based on their ability to get aid from the government and to afford living in exclusive places like Bexley. You see an African American in the steel car company. African Americans come and go through this workforce. It's pretty rough. People do die in this company from industrial accidents. So families come and live along Del Mar and Maryland, but they don't always stay. I'm going to bring our story to 1968, which is as far as I've gone in my own research on what's happening with minorities in Bexley's past. The reason I'm going to go there is because we have a remarkable survey by sociology students at Capitol from that year. This is an extraordinary time in American history. The Vietnam War is, reaching the point where Americans are no longer trusting the government. We're going to get to the point where Lyndon Baines Johnson can't run again because he's so deeply hated by the United States, by many people in the United States. That same year will be the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy. We've had a decade of 2 decades of civil rights agitation, a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act, but there's still a lot of frustration in America, and much of that frustration revolves around economics. What good is it for Black Americans to say, I can ride on the bus anywhere I want, except I can't afford it? Or to be stuck in northern urban areas, segregated by federal government policies and economic exclusivity to where they cannot get ahead. So it's in this heady mix of civil rights agitation and urban unrest and Vietnam protests that these students decide to go into Bexley streets and ask, how would you feel about Black people moving into Bexley? Well, they got unwelcome responses from lots of folks, including threats of like, get off my property, I'll call the police on you, verbal tongue lashings and the like. They did get some welcome responses as well. But what they found overall is that Bexley still had Black residents, all on Del Mar in the north. And most Bexley residents were okay with that. People who were interviewed said things like, well, Black people, only want to live beside white people because they want intermarriage. Some of the people they interviewed said, well, they don't know how to take care of their property. And if they move here, housing values are going to go down. It's going to hurt the wealth of my home, my investment. And one realtor, in fact, just flat out said, Bexley is a white community. And that's where it has been since 1968. Bexley is still about 88% white today, and that's the result of a history of economic exclusion. We'll exclude you on the basis of money, reinforced by Bexley's size. And the reason that works is it's a proxy for the larger pattern of segregation in American society as a whole. America still has an enormous problem of wealth distribution in terms of African Americans and whites. And because of that, African Americans have not been able, even in the last century, to put down the generational wealth needed to move forward in the same way that the Jeffreys and the Kilbournes and other folks were able to do over 100 years ago. And so they're behind in the economic race. Now, many people look at this and see, well, that's just race neutral. Very few discriminatory practices other than, say, Alexander Forrest. It's just your ability to pay. But because wealth is a proxy for race in the United States, it results in the same effect. And it has meant that Bexley's diversity has been stunted by socioeconomics. And the question we face today is, what are we going to do about it? You, as members of the Charter Commission, have choices that you need to make, taking in data, looking at all the information, and what can be done in order to make Bexley a more equitable place than its ancestors envisioned when they were creating it 100 years ago. Thank you for your time and attention.